will see about Chapter 2, Unit 1. So Chapter 2 is all about Contract Act. Now this is very, very simple chapter. We will have a quick overview or revision of Chapter 2, Unit 1, which is about Indian Contract Act 1872. And this Unit 1 is all about elements, essentials and types of contract. So before that, how has contract evolved? Right before Indian Contract Act 1872, historical context, if we go to see historical context, in the ancient and medieval period, before Contract Act, before we have this Contract Act, we had Vedas, Dharma Shastras, Smritis and Shrutis. And then came Mauryan period. Then contract were referred to as bilateral transactions, that is mutual contract or consent regarding terms and conditions. Like for example, A and B, there are two parties A and B, and A is selling, for example, sells 100 bales of cotton at 100 per kilo, and B agrees to the same. Now this is what we called as bilateral. Bi, as the name suggests, is two parties. So basically two parties agree and consent to the terms and conditions, and then they enter into a contract. That was during the Mauryan period. And then after that, during Mughal era, the government shifted to Mohammedan law of contract. So under Mohammedan law of contract, there were some key terms: Aqd, Ijab and Qabul. So Aqd meaning contract or conjunction. So basically contract is referred to as Aqd, was referred to as Aqd during Mughal era. And then came Ijab. Ijab means proposal and Qabul means acceptance. So we will later on see about the contract, which is again, so contract is nothing but agreement plus legal enforceability. So that I can explain you this part, which is Mughal era. So before that, let's see. Contract means agreement plus there has to be legal enforceability, then it's called a contract. So agreement means offer a proposal and acceptance and consideration. So these terms are included over there. Again, I'll explain you in detail when we come to the part of contract. So Aqd means contract, Ijab means proposal and Qabul means acceptance. So formation of contract meant no formalities during that point of time. There were only mutual consent from both the parties, that's it. So initially, if we again summarize, so quickly recap. Initially during ancient and medieval period, there was Veda, Dharma Shastras, Smritis and Shrutis. During Mauryan period, there were bilateral transactions, that is mutual consent of two parties. And then Mughal era, wherein we had the Mohammedan law of contract, key terms being Aqd, Ijab and Qabul. So then during that point of time, there was contract, that is only mutual consent from both the parties, no formalities as such. What are the differences between Hindu and English law? So Hindu law is generally a compilation of all the custom and interpretation by Smritikaras, which differs significantly from English law. Now under Hindu law, we had the following terms and definitions, right? So individuals who are minors, intoxicated persons, elderly or handicapped individuals, they deemed as incapable of entering into valid contracts. Basically, they are not competing parties to enter into contract. The ones who are minors, intoxicated persons, elderly and handicapped individuals. So definitions of age. Whom do we call as minor? Generally, persons below 18 years. But if we again further delve deep into the concept, based on Hindu law, up to 8 years they called as infant. Person is called as infant. 8 to 16 years it's called boyhood. 16 years above, then they will compete into contract. Now it is 18 years, but earlier now up to 8 years they called as infant. 8 to 16 they called as boyhood. So above 16 then they compete into contract at that point of time. But now more than equal to 18 years, only then they consider as major and as compete into contract. British colonial influence. During British period, English law was applied in Presidency town of Madras, Bombay and Calcutta under Charter of 1726. During British period, at that point of time, English law was applied in Presidency town of Madras, Bombay and Calcutta. Now what about other places outside the Presidency towns of Madras, Bombay and Calcutta? What about those areas? Those areas, they were generally following the principles of justice, equity and good conscience, and that's how they were resolving the disputes. Suppose if different religions were involved, then in that case law of defendant was applied. Law of defendant, what do you mean by law of defendant? Like for example, A has filed a case against B, then A is referred to as plaintiff and B is a defendant. In that case, defendant's law of land would be applied. Transition to Indian Contract Act. So far we saw earlier like what all were there. and how the Contract Act has evolved. Now we have Indian Contract Act 1872. So what about Indian Contract Act of 1872? Law of contract introduction. So what about the importance of contract law? Why do we need to have contract law? So why is it important? Because it's crucial for trade, commerce and industry. Let's take for example two parties entering into a contract, A and B entering into a contract. A is selling goods worth 50,000 to B, and let's take for example, after selling the goods, B is supposed to make the payment of 50,000, right? But B is not making the payment. Now what does B have to do? What remedy does B have? What can B do in that case? So in that case he can follow the Contract Act. So it's crucial for trade, commerce and industry. Indian Contract Act 1872, it was established on April 25, 1872. It came into effect on September 1, 1872. Now this applies to whole of India, including Jammu and Kashmir. Structure of the Act. So if we go to see the general principles, it covers the foundational principles. Again, it's applied to all the contracts. Section 1 to 75 we have. So section 1 to 75 we have general principles, which is again applied to all the contracts. Whereas special contracts, section 124 to 238, we have specific types of contract like indemnity or special types of contract, which we will again see in detail in the forthcoming chapters. Indemnity, guarantee, bailment, pledge and agency. Nature of contracts. So this chapter will define the rights and duties of parties involved in business transaction and will provide a framework rather than prescriptive rights and duties. Legally enforceable contract. So contract has to be legally enforceable. Again, we will see in detail in the definition, including rules for offer and acceptance, revocation, conditions under which the agreement may be voidable or void. So basically, what do you mean by contract? Contract is an agreement enforceable by law. What do you mean by agreement? Agreement is offer or proposal plus acceptance plus consideration. So let's take for example, okay, not over here, let's move that note page. So what do you mean by agreement? So agreement means offer or proposal plus acceptance plus consideration. Now that's what is called as agreement. What do they mean by this? What do they mean by this? So let's take for example, A is selling goods to B, or maybe let's take for example A is offering his car, let's take for example white car for 5 lakh rupee, right? So A is making an offer to B. Okay, A is making an offer to B. He is selling his white car for 5 lakh. Now it is up to B whether he can accept it or not. Now A is making an offer or proposal is made by A. Let's take for example B is also intending to buy a car, and B is okay with what A is offering, the price, the car, the features and everything. B is completely okay with it. Now B is accepting the offer, so he is making an acceptance. And you think there is consideration between A and B? Yes, for sure there is consideration. So what is the consideration? So again, if we go to see the concept of consideration, so consideration is basically referred to as quid pro quo. What do you mean by quid pro quo? Quid pro quo means something in return. Something in return. Like for example, A is offering car to B. So A will be giving his car to B. In turn, in return, what is he getting from B? 5 lakh. So 5 lakh is a consideration for A. For whatever that A is offering, he is getting 5 lakh. 5 lakh is a consideration for A. And what is the consideration for B? What is the consideration for B? For 5 lakh that he is paying, he is getting the car, right? So car is a consideration for B. Now usually we think that consideration is something monetary, but it need not be. It's something in return. It can be either monetary or non-monetary. So in this case, an offer or proposal is made by A and it's accepted by B for a consideration. B's consideration is the car for the amount that is paying. A's consideration is 5 lakh for the car that is giving to B, for the car that is selling to B. So in this case, there's proposal offer plus acceptance plus consideration. And when they agree that A is making an offer, B is agreeing, is accepting for consideration, now that's called an agreement. Offer or proposal plus acceptance plus consideration. But do you think all agreements are contracts? No, it is not so. Why? Why is the case? So agreement is generally offer or proposal plus acceptance plus consideration. All right, understood. Now Why are not all agreements contracts? Because they're clearly saying that agreements which have legal enforceability are contracts. So again, this can be divided into two categories: social agreements and the ones that are legally enforceable. Now, what do you mean by this? See, social agreements are one. For example, let's take for example. So let's take for example. Social agreement is one wherein, for example, Mr. A is giving his CA foundation exams. In, for example, May 2025. And there's an agreement with the father. Mr. A is entering into an agreement with his father that if his father is saying that if you clear CA foundation exams, then I will give you 50,000. If you clear the exams, then I'll pay you 50,000. Now this is agreement between A and Mr. A and Mr. A's father. Now take for example, Mr. A clears his exam, results are out, and Mr. A clears his exam. And after that, now he's asking his father that you've agreed to pay me 50,000 if I clear the exams. Now I cleared the exams. And after that, Mr. A's father is responding that he will not pay this 50,000. He's saying that no 50,000 now. In that case, now this kind of agreement is one wherein, so just because Mr. A's father is not paying, can Mr. A file a case in a court of law? Whether he can file a suit for the same? No, definitely no. So in this case, this is just a social agreement. So social agreement is one wherein there is no legal enforceability only. So what do you mean by legal enforceability? Legal enforceability is one wherein in a contract you can proceed to file a suit in a court of law. So legal enforceability means it's legally enforceable in the court of law. That is, you can file a suit. Only then it's said to be legally enforceable, but in this case you will not be able to. So this is a kind of social agreement and not legally enforceable. And let's take another example wherein, so this is one, but it's a social agreement. And let's take another example wherein A is selling goods to B worth 50,000. Now in this case, A has sold the goods, right? So if B is not making the payment, B refuses to make the payment after receiving the goods, whether A can file a suit in the court of law? Yeah, I know you would have guessed it right. A can file a suit in the court of law. So which means this agreement is a legally enforceable agreement. So agreements can be of two types. It can be social or it can be legally enforceable. Only legally enforceable agreements are contracts. The ones which are not legally enforceable. See, here also it's an agreement. Why it's an agreement? Because there is offer by father. There is acceptance by son. There is consideration flowing in as well. But what about legal enforceability? It's not. So this is also an agreement, but it's a social agreement. It's not legally enforceable agreement. So that is something that we need to understand very clearly over here. Contract is something which is defined under section 2H. So contract is something that is defined under section 2H of the Indian Contract Act. What are the essential elements? 3 elements are there: offer of proposal, acceptance and consideration. There are 3 elements basically. And offer of proposal plus acceptance plus consideration becomes an agreement. But are all agreements contracts? Definitely no. Social agreements are only social agreements. It's not a contract. Only legally enforceable agreements are contract. Now let's take for example over here valid contract. Scenario is A agrees to sell a car to B for 2 lakh. So here A's obligation is he must deliver the car to B. B's obligation, what are they obliged to do? A is obliged to deliver the car to B. B is obliged to pay 2 lakhs to A. What are their rights? B's right. B is paying 2 lakh. What is his right? To receive the car. And what about A's right? A is receiving the A is selling the car, so he has a right to receive 2 lakh. So this is a valid contract. Why? There's a clear agreement and it's also legally enforceable with mutual obligation and intention to create legal relationships. So there's agreement as well as legal enforceability. Only that we call as contract and not otherwise. Example of social agreement. Father promises to pay his son 500 every month as pocket money. Now this is a type of social agreement. It's not a valid contract. Why? This is also an agreement, but it's a Social agreement, not a legally enforceable agreement. Outcome: father refuses to pay. This is considered a social agreement, not a contract, because it lacks the intention to create legal obligation. Son cannot enforce his promise in court as it does not meet the criteria for valid contract. Then certain examples are given. What is the difference between certain examples are given? What are the differences between enforceable contract and social agreement? So enforceable contract and social agreement. Social agreement means social agreement only. Enforceable contract means a valid contract. Valid contract, that is legally enforceable contract. Okay, so what are the differences between agreement and contract? So agreement is every promise and certain promise forming consideration for each other. That is promise plus consideration. Now also one more thing that we will have to clarify over here, alright. So which is nothing but, see over here we saw that agreement is equal to offer or proposal plus acceptance plus consideration. Person is offering, other one is accepting, which is called a promise. Offer plus acceptance becomes a promise. Plus when combined with consideration, it becomes an agreement. So after this we will discuss in part 2 of the same lecture. We will revise the remaining, which is from the basis of difference, or let's complete this, and from essentials of valid contract we'll continue with the next, from the next or part 2 of the video. So basically one thing that I will have to tell over here is that offer a proposal plus acceptance becomes a promise, because once you offer and then the other party accepts, it automatically becomes a promise, right? So it's basically promise plus consideration. Promise is nothing but offer or proposal plus acceptance. So your agreement is nothing but offer or proposal plus acceptance plus consideration. And what about contract? Contract is also an agreement, but it has legal enforceability scope. It's a wider term because legal and social, both types of agreement are included, whereas this is narrower in nature, narrow sense, because this includes only legally enforceable agreement. What about legal obligation? Agreement may not create legal obligation, does not always grant rights to parties. There's no legal relationship or legal obligation only over here, whereas contract, there's always legal obligation. Nature: all agreement are not contracts, all contracts are agreement. Why? Because agreement can be of two types, can be social agreement, can be legally enforceable agreement. So all agreement are not contracts, because agreements can be social agreements also. In that case it's not contract. Whereas all contracts are agreement, because all contracts are agreement, but their one thing is that they are legally enforceable agreements. So let's stop with this, and then balance we will continue in the part 2 of the same video, of the same chapter.